Elena Martinez was wiping down the piano keys when her phone rang. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and she'd just finished teaching little Tommy Chen his scales for what felt like the 100th time. The kid had spent more time looking at his phone than at the sheet music. And honestly, she couldn't blame him. Piano lessons weren't exactly thrilling when your teacher operated out of a cramped studio above a laundromat. She almost didn't answer the call. Unknown number. Probably another spam call about her car's extended warranty. But something made her pick up. "Is this Elena Martinez, the piano teacher?" The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who wore expensive perfume and never had to check their bank account before buying groceries. "Yes, that's me," Elena said, already preparing her standard speech about lesson rates and availability. "Wonderful. My name is Patricia Wentworth, and I'm a wedding planner. I'm organizing an event at the Grandview Hotel this Saturday evening, and our pianist just canceled. Food poisoning, apparently. I found your listing online, and I was hoping you might be available to provide some background music. Just gentle, unobtrusive pieces. Nothing fancy. The kind of music that makes people feel sophisticated while they eat their salmon." Elena's first instinct was to say no. She didn't do events. She didn't do audiences. She taught children who didn't want to learn, and adults who thought 6 weeks of lessons would turn them into concert pianists. That was her life now, and she'd made peace with it. But then Patricia mentioned the payment, and Elena's hand tightened around the phone. That amount of money would cover 3 months of her mother's medications. 3 months of not lying awake at night doing math in her head, trying to figure out which bills could wait and which ones absolutely couldn't. 3 months of not feeling her stomach drop every time she opened the mailbox. "I'll do it," she heard herself say. Patricia sounded relieved. "Excellent. The hotel has a beautiful grand piano. All you need to do is show up at 6, play some classical pieces, maybe a little jazz, nothing that will pull focus from the conversations. You understand? This is about ambiance, not performance." Elena understood perfectly. She'd been not pulling focus for 15 years now. After hanging up, she sat at her teaching piano and stared at her hands. 42 years old. And these hands that had once been called gifted now spent their days correcting finger positions and teaching Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star to kids who'd rather be literally anywhere else. She remembered being 17, standing on the stage at the regional competition, playing Chopin like her life depended on it. Because back then, it felt like it did. She remembered the judges' faces, the way they leaned forward in their seats. She remembered believing, truly believing, that she was destined for something more than this. But life had a funny way of taking those dreams and filing them away in a drawer you stopped opening. The conservatory rejection had come first. Then her father's sudden death, leaving her mother alone and struggling. Then the realization that talent didn't pay bills, but teaching piano to dentists' children did. 15 years had passed in what felt like both a moment and a lifetime, and here she was, wiping down piano keys in a studio that smelled like fabric softener from the laundromat below. The days leading up to Saturday passed in their usual rhythm. Mrs. Peterson's daughter, who had the musical instinct of a rock, but whose mother insisted she'd bloom eventually. The teenage boy who actually showed promise but was too cool to admit he enjoyed playing. The retired accountant who came every Thursday and played the same 3 songs with determined mediocrity. Elena didn't tell any of them about the wedding. What was there to tell? She was background noise, hired ambiance, the human equivalent of a fancy centerpiece. Saturday arrived with gray clouds and the threat of rain. Elena pulled out the one good dress she owned, a simple black number she'd bought for her cousin's funeral 3 years ago. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman who'd learned to make herself invisible. Maybe that was exactly what this job required. She arrived at the Grandview Hotel at 5:45, using the service entrance like Patricia had instructed. The hotel was the kind of place Elena had only seen in magazines, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers and the subtle scent of old money. She felt like an imposter just walking through the hallways. Patricia met her outside the ballroom, already looking stressed, checking her tablet with rapid finger movements. "You're here. Good. The piano's set up in the corner. Here's a list of suggested pieces. Standards, mostly. Keep it light, keep it quiet. The Wentworth-Chen wedding is extremely important. Half the city council is here along with major donors to the Arts Foundation. We need everything to be perfect." Elena took the list, glancing at the familiar titles. Moon River. The Way You Look Tonight. Clair de Lune, if she wanted to get adventurous. Songs that had been played at 1,000 weddings by 1,000 forgettable pianists. "One more thing," Patricia added, lowering her voice. "Whatever you do, don't draw attention to yourself. You're here to enhance the atmosphere, not to be part of it. Understand?" Elena understood. She'd been understanding that message her whole life. She made her way into the ballroom, and her heart sank. The beautiful grand piano Patricia had mentioned was actually a beat-up upright pushed awkwardly against the kitchen doors, half hidden behind a decorative screen. The bench wobbled when she sat down. 2 of the keys stuck slightly when she tested them. But the money. She thought about her mother's pill bottles lined up on the kitchen counter, the way her mom tried to hide how much pain she was in, the medical bills that kept coming like an endless tide. Elena could play a battered upright. She could be invisible. She could be anything if it meant her mother didn't have to choose between medication and groceries. The guests began arriving in their expensive suits and designer dresses, their laughter filling the room like champagne bubbles. Elena started playing, her fingers moving through the familiar melodies with practiced ease. No one looked at her. No one needed to. She was doing exactly what she'd been hired to do, disappearing into the background while making the foreground feel more elegant. And for the first hour, everything went exactly according to plan. She had no idea that everything was about to change. Elena had been playing for about an hour when her fingers started moving on autopilot. That's what happened when you played the same safe songs over and over. Your hands knew where to go without your brain having to show up. She watched the guests mingle, their voices rising and falling like waves, nobody sparing even a glance toward the corner where she sat. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne, and she caught the scent of something expensive, the kind of champagne that probably cost more than she made in a week. The guests were laughing now, their jewelry catching the light from the chandeliers. Everything sparkled here. The glasses, the silverware, the people themselves. They belonged to a world that Elena had stopped believing she'd ever be part of. She transitioned from autumn leaves into a softer version of unforgettable, keeping her touch light, her presence even lighter. A woman in a red dress walked past, talking loudly on her phone about a real estate deal. She didn't even notice she was standing right next to the piano. That's when the doors opened, and a group of latecomers entered the ballroom. Elena didn't look up immediately. She'd learned that looking at guests made them uncomfortable, like she was asking for something, acknowledgement maybe, or validation that she existed. So she kept her eyes on the keys, following the familiar patterns her fingers knew by heart. But something made her glance up. Maybe it was the way the room shifted slightly, the conversations pausing for just a moment as these new arrivals made their entrance. Or maybe it was some instinct she didn't know she still had. There were 4 of them, all older, all dressed in that particular way that wealthy people dressed when they wanted to look casual, but still important. 3 of them she didn't recognize. But the 4th one, Elena's hands faltered. Just for a second, just long enough that she hit a wrong note. Nobody noticed. Nobody ever noticed. But she noticed, and her heart was suddenly beating too fast. Mikhail Rostov. 20 years had passed since she'd last seen him in person, but she'd have recognized that face anywhere. those sharp eyes. That distinctive silver hair, the way he carried himself like someone who'd spent his entire life commanding orchestras and concert halls. He was older now, his face more lined, but there was no mistaking him. Mikhail Rostov, the legendary conductor, the man who'd been the guest judge at her conservatory audition, the man who'd written a single word on her evaluation form that had changed the entire trajectory of her life. Adequate. She'd been 17 years old, standing in front of a panel of judges at the Regional Arts Academy, playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. She'd practiced for months. Her teacher had told her she was ready, that she had something special. She'd played that audition like her soul was on fire, pouring everything she had into every note. And when the results came back, there it was, in Mikhail Rostov's handwriting. Adequate. Not promising, not needs work, not even not ready yet, just adequate. The kind of word you'd use to describe a sandwich that didn't quite have enough flavor. The kind of word that said, "You're fine," but why would anyone want fine when they could have extraordinary? Elena had kept that evaluation form for 5 years before finally throwing it away. But she'd never forgotten the word. It had lived inside her head like a permanent resident, showing up whenever she thought about playing seriously again, whenever she thought maybe she could try for something more than teaching scales to disinterested kids. Adequate. Not quite good enough, not special, not worth the investment of time or attention. And now here he was, walking into this ballroom, heading toward a table near the front with his companions. He was laughing at something one of them said, holding a glass of wine, completely unaware that the invisible woman in the corner playing background music was someone whose dreams he'd casually destroyed 2 decades ago. Elena's hands kept playing, but her mind was spinning. What were the chances? What were the actual chances that of all the weddings in this city on this particular night, Mikhail Rostov would walk into this one? She watched as he sat down at his table, still talking with his friends. Patricia, the wedding planner, appeared at his side almost immediately, shaking his hand with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for very important guests. Of course he was important. Mikhail Rostov was a fixture in this city's cultural scene. He'd conducted the Philharmonic for 15 years. He sat on the boards of 3 different arts organizations. People like Patricia probably dreamed about having him at their events. Elena forced herself to look away, to focus on the music. But her fingers felt clumsy now, uncertain. She was supposed to be invisible, but she suddenly felt exposed, like at any moment he might look over and recognize her. Though why would he? She'd been one audition among hundreds, thousands probably, over the course of his career. One adequate girl who hadn't made the cut. She transitioned into "The Way You Look Tonight," keeping her tempo steady even though her pulse wasn't. The speeches would start soon. Patricia had told her to keep playing softly during the toasts, something about maintaining the elegant atmosphere. Elena could do that. She'd been maintaining elegant atmospheres for years. But then Mikhail Rostov turned in his chair and his eyes swept across the room. Elena ducked her head quickly, letting her hair fall forward slightly to obscure her face. She was being ridiculous. He wouldn't remember her. He wouldn't. His gaze stopped, right on her. Elena's breath caught. She kept playing, but she could feel his eyes on her, could feel him studying her with the same intensity he'd probably used when evaluating musicians for 4 decades. The moment stretched out, elastic and uncomfortable. Then his expression changed. She saw it happen. The casual curiosity shifting into something else. Recognition? No, that wasn't quite right. He didn't know who she was. But he was seeing something that had caught his attention. Something that had pulled his focus away from his conversation. He leaned over to one of his companions and said something, gesturing slightly toward the piano. The other person glanced over, shrugged, said something back. Mikhail Rostov didn't look away. Elena felt her face getting hot. This was the opposite of invisible. This was the opposite of not drawing attention. She needed to fade back into the background to become what Patricia had hired her to be: pleasant, forgettable ambiance. The speeches began. The best man stood up with a microphone, making jokes about how the groom had proposed 3 times before the bride finally said yes. Everyone laughed. Elena played softer, following Patricia's instructions, making herself into sonic wallpaper. But every few minutes, she couldn't help it. She glanced toward Mikhail Rostov's table. And more often than not, she found him looking back. Not in a creepy way, exactly. More like he was trying to figure something out. Like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. After the speeches ended, there was a break before the cake cutting. Patricia had told Elena to take 10 minutes, grab some water from the kitchen if she needed it. But Elena stayed at the piano, her hands resting on the keys, trying to steady her breathing. She heard footsteps approaching, expensive shoes on marble floor. Every instinct told her not to look up, but she did anyway. Mikhail Rostov stood beside the piano, looking down at her with those sharp, evaluating eyes she remembered from 20 years ago. "You play well," he said. His voice was accented, Russian heritage blending with decades in America. "For background music." It wasn't a compliment. Elena heard the qualifier, the slight emphasis on those last 2 words. For background music, for someone who wasn't trying, for someone who was adequate. She met his eyes. "Thank you." "Do you take requests?" he asked. "I have a list I'm supposed to follow," she said carefully. "But I can probably accommodate something if it's not too—" "Play something real," he interrupted. "Something that matters. Something that makes people actually listen instead of just filling the silence." Elena's hands tightened on the edge of the piano bench. 20 years. 20 years of that word adequate living in her head. 20 years of playing it safe, of being forgettable, of convincing herself that teaching was enough, that she'd made peace with a smaller life. And here was the man who'd written that word, asking her to play something real. "I'm here to provide ambiance," she said, hearing how small her voice sounded. "Not to perform." Mikhail Rostov's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Disappointment, maybe, or confirmation of something he'd already suspected. "Of course," he said. "I understand. Background music for background players." He walked away before she could respond, returning to his table where his companions waited with their expensive wine and their important conversations. Elena sat frozen at the piano, his words echoing in her head. Background players. Her hands were shaking. Elena's hands were still shaking when Patricia appeared beside the piano 15 minutes later, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield against chaos. "They're about to cut the cake," Patricia said, her voice tight with stress. She'd probably been running around all evening putting out small fires that guests would never notice. "I need something soft, romantic. You know, something that makes people think about love and happily ever after. Can you do that?" Elena nodded. She could do that. She'd been doing that for years, playing what people wanted to hear, making herself small, staying in her lane. "Perfect," Patricia said, already walking away. "Keep it gentle. Nothing dramatic." Nothing dramatic. Right. Because heaven forbid the piano player actually make people feel something. Elena looked down at her hands. They'd stopped shaking, but they felt different somehow. Like they were waiting for something. Like they'd been waiting for 20 years. She glanced toward Mikhail Rostov's table. He was leaning back in his chair, talking to the woman beside him. His wine glass tilting casually in his hand. He'd already forgotten about her, already dismissed her, just like he had 2 decades ago. Background players. The bride and groom were making their way to the elaborate cake. 5 tiers of white fondant and sugar flowers that probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent. Cameras were flashing. Everyone was gathering around, smiling those practiced smiles that people wore at weddings. Elena's fingers found the keys. She started with Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Safe. Beautiful. The kind of piece that had been played at 10,000 weddings before this one. Her fingers moved through the familiar melody, and she could almost feel Patricia's approval from across the room. The bride was laughing as the groom fed her a piece of cake. Someone's aunt was crying happy tears. Everything was exactly as it should be, elegant, controlled, predictable. But something was building inside Elena's chest, something hot and sharp and impossible to ignore. She kept thinking about that evaluation form. Adequate. She kept thinking about the girl she'd been at 17, so full of hope and fire and the absolute certainty that music was her destiny. She kept thinking about all the years since then, the teaching, the bills, the slow erosion of dreams into something manageable and safe. She kept thinking about Mikhail Rostov's face as he'd walked away from her piano. That look of confirmation, like she'd proven exactly what he'd always suspected, that she was ordinary, that she'd never been special at all. Her fingers were still playing Chopin, but her mind was somewhere else. She was back in that audition room, 17 years old, sitting at a grand piano in front of 5 judges. She'd worn a blue dress her mother had saved for months to buy. Her hands had been sweating, her heart had been pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. And she'd played Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the second movement, arranged for solo piano because that's all she'd had access to. She'd spent 6 months learning it, practicing until her fingers ached, until she could play it in her sleep. She'd played it like her life depended on it. Because back then it had. The Chopin was ending. Elena was supposed to transition into something else from Patricia's list. Claire de Lune, maybe, or one of those jazz standards that made people feel sophisticated without actually having to think about the music, but her hands had other ideas. Almost without deciding to, she found herself playing the opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, just the first few notes. The melody that had lived in her fingers for 20 years, even when she'd tried to forget it. She should stop. She should go back to the safe music, the background music, the music that didn't ask anything of anyone. But those words kept echoing in her head. Background players. Her fingers kept moving. The melody grew, building on itself, and suddenly she wasn't in the Grand View Hotel ballroom anymore. She was 17 again, playing for judges who held her future in their hands. She was every version of herself she'd ever been. The hopeful girl, the disappointed young woman, the tired teacher who'd stopped believing in miracles. And she was angry. Not the quiet, manageable anger she'd learned to swallow over the years. Real anger. The kind that had been sleeping inside her for 2 decades, waiting for permission to wake up. Her hands moved across the keys with a force she hadn't let herself use in years. The battered upright piano responded, singing out notes that cut through the polite conversation and champagne bubbles like a knife through silk. She was playing the full arrangement now, the version she'd created when she was 17, because she couldn't afford an orchestra. Every note was exactly where she'd left it, stored in her muscle memory like a secret she'd kept even from herself. This was the piece Mikhail Rostov had called Adequate. This was the performance that had ended her dreams. And she was playing it now, not because anyone asked, not because it fit the mood, but because something inside her had finally broken open and refused to be quiet anymore. The music filled the ballroom, complex and raw, and absolutely impossible to ignore. Elena wasn't trying to blend into the background. She wasn't trying to make people comfortable. She was playing like she had something to prove. To Rostov, to herself, to every person who'd ever told her to play it safe. She could feel the room changing around her, though she didn't look up. The conversations were stopping. The pleasant buzz of the reception was dissolving into something else. Silence, except for the piano, except for her. Her fingers flew across the keys, hitting notes that made the old upright shudder with the effort. The second movement of Rachmaninoff's concerto wasn't meant to be polite. It wasn't meant to fade into the background. It was passionate and complicated and demanding, and Elena was playing it like she'd been holding it inside her chest for 20 years, waiting for this exact moment to let it out. She was crying. She realized it halfway through, felt the tears on her face, but her hands never stopped. If anything, they played harder, faster, more fierce. Every rejection, every compromise, every student who didn't care, every bill she couldn't pay, every dream she'd folded up and put away, all of it was pouring out through her fingers. This was what real music felt like. Not background noise, not pleasant ambiance. This was music that grabbed you by the throat and demanded you pay attention. Elena hit the crescendo, her whole body leaning into it, the piano singing out with a power she'd forgotten it could have. She wasn't thinking about Patricia or her list of approved songs. She wasn't thinking about the bride and groom or their expensive cake. She wasn't even thinking about Mikhail Rostov. She was just playing, really playing. For the first time in 15 years, the melody soared and dipped, twisted and turned, pulling emotion from places Elena had forgotten existed. Her mother, lying in bed with pain she tried to hide. Her father's funeral when she was 19. The conservatory rejection letter. The studio above the laundromat. Every moment that had led her here, to this borrowed piano in this ballroom full of strangers. She played all of it. The music built toward its conclusion, and Elena knew she had about 30 seconds left. 30 seconds before this moment ended and reality came crashing back. 30 seconds before Patricia rushed over, horrified. 30 seconds before she had to face whatever consequences came from breaking every rule she'd been hired to follow. But for these 30 seconds, she was free. Her hands found the final chord, and she held it, letting it ring out through the ballroom, letting it fade slowly into silence. Elena's hands lifted from the keys. The room was absolutely quiet. She sat there, breathing hard, her face wet with tears, finally looking up at the crowd of strangers who'd come here expecting nothing more than a nice wedding with pleasant background music. Every single person in the ballroom was staring at her. The bride was frozen, knife still hovering over the cake. The groom had his mouth open slightly, like he'd been about to say something and forgotten how words worked. Patricia was standing by the wall, her clipboard dangling from her hand, her face pale. And at his table near the front, Mikhail Rostov was standing. His wine glass was on the table, forgotten. His hands were gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. He was staring at Elena like he was seeing her for the first time, like he was seeing a ghost. The silence stretched out, elastic and fragile. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Elena couldn't breathe. What had she done? Then someone started clapping. It was one of the older guests, a woman in a purple dress who Elena didn't recognize. Her applause was slow at first, deliberate, each clap echoing in the silent room. Then someone else joined in, then another, then 10 people, 20, 50. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was erupting in applause. People were standing now, some of them with tears streaming down their faces. The bride was clapping so hard her bouquet fell to the floor. Someone near the back was actually cheering. Elena sat at the piano, stunned, as the wave of applause crashed over her. And through it all, Mikhail Rostov just stood there, staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't the look of someone watching adequate playing. It was the look of someone who'd just realized they'd made a terrible mistake. The applause seemed to go on forever. Elena sat frozen at the piano, her hands still hovering over the keys, unable to process what was happening. This wasn't how background pianists were supposed to be treated. This wasn't how invisible people were supposed to feel. Someone near the front was wiping their eyes with a napkin. A man in a tuxedo was shaking his head in disbelief, still clapping. The bride had abandoned her cake entirely and was walking toward the piano, her dress sweeping across the floor. "That was incredible," the bride said, and her voice was shaking. I can't." She stopped, pressing her hand to her chest. "You just made my wedding unforgettable." Elena opened her mouth to apologize, to explain that she'd gone off script, that she hadn't meant to steal focus from the ceremony. But the bride was already turning to the crowd, her face bright with emotion. "Everyone, can we please give another round of applause for—" She paused, looking back at Elena with sudden embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, I don't even know your name." "Elena," she managed to say. "Elena Martinez." "For Elena Martinez," the bride announced, and the applause surged again, louder this time. Patricia was threading through the crowd now, and Elena braced herself for the anger, the professional disappointment, maybe even being asked to leave. But when Patricia reached the piano, her expression wasn't angry. It was complicated, stunned, maybe even a little scared but not angry. "That wasn't on the list," Patricia said quietly. "I know. I'm sorry, Stop." Patricia held up her hand. "Don't apologize. Do you see these people? Half of them are crying. The mayor's wife just told me this is the most moving thing she's experienced at a wedding in 30 years. She leaned in closer. "I have no idea what just happened. But you just turned a nice event into something people will talk about forever." Elena didn't know what to say to that. She glanced past Patricia toward Mikhail Rostov's table. He was still standing, but now he was having an intense conversation with one of his companions. Even from across the room, she could see how animated he was, his hands moving as he spoke. A young man in his 20s appeared beside the piano, holding up his phone. "That was amazing," he said. "I recorded the whole thing. Would it be okay if I posted it? My friends need to see this." Elena's first instinct was to say no. She'd spent 15 years avoiding attention, staying out of the spotlight. But something had shifted in the last 10 minutes. Something fundamental. "Sure," she heard herself say. "That's fine." The young man grinned and immediately started typing on his phone. Elena watched him walk away, already showing the video to people at his table. They crowded around the screen, watching, and then looked over at her with new eyes. The reception had transformed. People weren't going back to their polite conversations. They were gathering in clusters, talking animatedly, gesturing toward the piano. A few had their phones out, taking pictures. The energy in the room had completely changed. It was electric now, alive in a way it hadn't been when Elena was playing her safe, forgettable background music. She stood up from the piano bench, her legs a little unsteady. She needed water. She needed air. She needed a moment to understand what had just happened. But Mikhail Rostov was walking toward her, cutting through the crowd with purpose, and Elena's heart jumped into her throat. He stopped a few feet away from her, and for a long moment he just looked at her. Really looked at her. In a way he hadn't 20 years ago when she'd been just another audition, just another hopeful kid with dreams too big for her talent. 20 years, he finally said. His voice was quiet enough that only she could hear. 20 years I've been conducting, teaching, judging, and I have never— He stopped, shook his head. "Where did you study?" "Regional Arts Academy," Elena said. "Or I tried to. I auditioned for the conservatory program when I was 17. Something flickered across his face. "What piece did you play?" "Rachmaninoff. Piano Concerto No. 2. The same one I just played." He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, there was something like pain in them. "And the evaluation?" Elena had memorized it years ago, even though she'd thrown away the form. She'd never forget it. "The technical execution was adequate, lacks the emotional depth required for professional performance." "God," Rostov said, and it came out like a confession. "I wrote that. I know. I was wrong. He said it simply, with no excuses. I was completely, devastatingly wrong. What you just played— He gestured toward the piano, struggling for words. That wasn't adequate. That was exceptional. That was the kind of playing that reminds people why music matters. Elena felt tears threatening again. She'd imagined this moment so many times over the years, confronting him, telling him how much his words had hurt, making him understand what he'd taken from her. But now that it was happening, she found she wasn't angry anymore. She was just tired. "Do you know what I've been doing for the past 15 years?" she asked. "Teaching scales to kids who don't want to learn, playing background music at events where nobody listens, trying to convince myself that I'd made peace with being ordinary." "You're not ordinary," Rostov said fiercely. "You never were. I was—" He paused, seemed to be wrestling with something. "I was a coward. You were terrifying." Elena blinked. "What?" "The way you played at that audition. You had so much passion, so much fire. It was raw and unrefined, but it was real, and I was scared of it." He ran a hand through his silver hair. "I'd spent my whole career around musicians who were technically perfect but emotionally safe, controlled, predictable. And here was this 17-year-old girl playing like she was trying to set the world on fire, and I didn't know what to do with that. So I wrote 'adequate' on a form and told myself I was doing you a favor." Elena's throat was tight. "A favor?" "I told myself you weren't ready, that you needed more training, more discipline, that the passion would burn you out." He met her eyes. "But the truth is, I was protecting myself. Protected, controlled musicians don't challenge you. They don't make you question whether you've been doing things wrong your whole career. You were dangerous, so I eliminated the danger." People were starting to notice them talking. A few guests had pulled out their phones, taking pictures. Elena saw the young man who'd recorded her performance watching them with interest. "I don't know what to do with this," Elena admitted. "I don't know how to— I've spent 20 years believing I wasn't good enough." "You were always good enough," Rostov said. "Better than good enough. And now—" He glanced around the ballroom, at the people still talking about her performance, at the bride who was showing her new husband the video on someone's phone. "Now everyone else knows it too." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. "The Philharmonic is performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 next month. Full orchestra. We've been rehearsing with a soloist who's technically perfect and emotionally empty. Every rehearsal feels like I'm watching someone go through the motions." He held out the card. "I want you to take his place." Elena stared at the card like it might bite her. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." He pressed the card into her hand. "You have something that can't be taught. You have what I've been looking for in musicians for 40 years and kept missing because I was too afraid to recognize it." He paused. "Please, let me try to make this right." Elena looked down at the card. "Mikhail Rostov, principal conductor, City Philharmonic Orchestra." His personal number was written at the bottom in pen. "I have students," she said weakly. "I have responsibilities. I can't just—" "You can," he interrupted gently. "You can do exactly what you just did. You can stop playing it safe. You can stop being invisible." He stepped back, giving her space. "Think about it. But please, call me. Don't let another 20 years pass." He walked away before she could respond, leaving Elena standing by the piano with his card in her hand and her whole world tilting sideways. Her phone was buzzing in her small purse. She pulled it out and saw notifications flooding in. Text messages, missed calls, social media alerts. The video. That young man had posted the video, and it was already spreading. Her mom had called 3 times. Elena's hands were shaking as she called back. "Elena!" Her mother's voice was breathless. "Elena, Mrs. Chen just showed me a video. She said it's you playing piano at some fancy wedding. Is that real? Is that really you? Elena looked around the ballroom, at the people still staring at her, at the bride who'd said she made the wedding unforgettable, at the piano that had somehow become the center of everything. "Yeah, Mom," she said, and she was crying again, but this time it felt different. "Yeah, that's really me." "Baby," her mother said, and her voice was full of wonder and pride and something that sounded like tears. "I always knew. I always knew you had this in you." Elena closed her eyes, clutching the phone and Rostov's business card, letting herself feel it all. The fear, the possibility, the terrifying, exhilarating sense that her entire life was about to change. Around her, the wedding reception continued. But it wasn't the same event anymore. Nothing would ever be the same again. Elena woke up Sunday morning to 8:47 unread emails. She stared at her phone screen, certain it was a glitch. But as she scrolled through them, her heart started racing. 3 concert venues asking about her availability, a recording studio in Nashville wanting to discuss a project, 2 music festivals requesting performance proposals, and dozens, maybe hundreds, of messages from people who'd seen the video. The video. She pulled up the post from the young man at the wedding. It had been viewed over 2 million times in less than 12 hours. 2 million people had watched her play. 2 million strangers had seen her crying at a borrowed piano, pouring out 20 years of bottled-up dreams. The comments were overwhelming. This made me sob. Who is this woman? I don't even like classical music, but I watched this 5 times. The way she plays, you can feel every emotion. Elena set down her phone and walked to her mother's room. Her mom was already awake, sitting up in bed with her tablet, scrolling through something. She looked up when Elena appeared in the doorway. "You're famous," her mother said simply. "I don't want to be famous. I just—" Elena stopped, not sure how to finish that sentence. "I just wanted to play." Her mother patted the bed beside her. Elena sat down and her mom showed her the tablet screen. It was a news article. "Wedding pianist's stunning performance goes viral. Who is Elena Martinez?" "They found your studio," her mother said. "There's a reporter who wants an interview. And look," she scrolled down. "5 of your students have texted me. They all want to know if it's really you." Elena thought about little Tommy Chen, who barely paid attention during lessons. About the teenage boy who pretended not to care. About all the students she'd been teaching for years, showing them scales and finger positions while hiding the fact that she'd once wanted so much more than this. "What did you tell them?" Elena asked. "I told them their teacher is extraordinary," her mother said. "Something I've known for 42 years. Elena felt tears coming again. She'd cried more in the last 12 hours than she had in the last 12 years. "Mom, Mikhail Rostov offered me a chance to perform with the Philharmonic, full orchestra, next month." Her mother's eyes went wide. "The same Rostov who—" "Yeah, the same one." "And what did you tell him?" Elena pulled out the business card from her pocket. She'd been carrying it around since the wedding, taking it out every few hours to make sure it was real. "I didn't tell him anything yet. I don't know if I can do it. I haven't performed seriously in 20 years. What if I freeze up? What if I was just lucky last night? What if—" "Elena Rosa Martinez," her mother interrupted, using her full name the way she only did when she was about to say something important. "Do you remember what your father told you before your first recital? You were 8 years old and terrified." Elena remembered. She'd been so scared she'd almost thrown up backstage. He said, "The piano doesn't care if you're scared, it only cares if you're honest." Her mother took Elena's hand. "You were honest last night. Maybe for the first time in 20 years, you were completely honest. That's what people responded to, not perfection, honesty." Elena looked down at their joined hands. Her mother's fingers were bent with arthritis now, but they were still strong, still holding on. "What about your medications?" Elena asked. "What about the bills? If I take time off from teaching to prepare for this, we'll figure it out," her mother said firmly. "We always do. But I won't let you use me as an excuse to stay small. You've been taking care of me for years. Let me take care of you for once. Call him." That afternoon, Elena sat in her studio above the laundromat and dialed Mikhail Rostov's number. He answered on the second ring. "I was hoping you'd call," he said. "I'm terrified," Elena admitted. "Good. That means you care. When can you start rehearsing?" The next 4 weeks were the hardest of Elena's life. Rostov didn't go easy on her. He pushed her through rehearsals that left her hands aching and her confidence shattered. The orchestra members watched her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Who was this wedding pianist who thought she could perform with the city's Philharmonic? But Rostov believed in her. Every time she faltered, every time she wanted to quit, he'd stop the orchestra and make her try again. "You're playing it safe," he'd tell her. "Stop being adequate. Be extraordinary." Her students had been surprisingly supportive. Little Tommy Chen brought her a good luck card he'd made himself. The teenage boy asked if he could come watch her perform. Even Mrs. Peterson's daughter, who usually looked bored during every lesson, told her she'd seen the video and thought it was cool. The night of the performance arrived faster than Elena was ready for. She stood backstage at Symphony Hall, wearing a dress she'd borrowed from a former college roommate, her hands shaking so badly she had to sit on them. Rostov found her there, 20 minutes before curtain. "I'm going to mess this up," she said. "There are 2,000 people out there. What if I freeze? What if—" "Elena." He sat down beside her. "Do you remember what you felt at that wedding? When you decided to stop being invisible?" She remembered. The anger, the pain, the sudden overwhelming need to be honest even if it cost her everything. "That's what they came to hear," Rostov said. "Not a perfect performance. They came to hear you, the real you, the one who plays like she's on fire." Elena walked onto that stage 5 minutes later, her legs unsteady, her heart pounding. The concert hall was packed, every seat filled, people standing in the back. She saw her mother in the third row, surrounded by students and their parents. She saw the bride from the wedding, still glowing. She saw faces she didn't recognize, people who'd seen the video and bought tickets just to see if lightning could strike twice. She sat at the grand piano, a real one this time, beautiful and perfectly tuned. The orchestra waited behind her, 80 musicians ready to follow her lead. Rostov stood at his conductor's podium, his eyes meeting hers. He raised his baton. The orchestra began, and Elena closed her eyes, letting herself feel it. The fear, yes, but also the joy, the absolute terrifying joy of finally doing what she was meant to do. Her hands found the keys, and she played. She didn't play it perfectly. She missed 2 notes in the second movement. Her tempo wavered slightly during a difficult passage, but she played honestly. She played like someone who'd spent 20 years in the wilderness and finally found her way home. The audience didn't just applaud when it ended. They stood, they shouted, they cried. Elena stood at the piano, breathing hard, looking out at all those faces. Her mother was crying and clapping. Her students were on their feet. The bride from the wedding was holding up her phone, recording this moment too. And Mikhail Rostov, the man who'd once called her adequate, walked over to her. In front of 2,000 people, he took her hand and bowed to her. A gesture of respect, an apology, an acknowledgement of something that should have been recognized 20 years ago. The standing ovation continued for 7 minutes. Backstage afterward, Elena's phone was buzzing with new messages, more opportunities, more offers. A talent agent who wanted to represent her, a classical music magazine asking for an interview. But the message that made her cry was from her mother. "Your father would have been so proud. I am so proud. You didn't just play the piano tonight, you became yourself. Elena thought about the studio above the laundromat. She'd still go back tomorrow, still teach her students, because teaching mattered too. But now it would be different. She wouldn't be a failed musician hiding behind lesson plans. She'd be someone who'd found her way back to herself, someone who'd learned that it's never too late. That adequate was just one person's opinion. That the only person who could really silence her was herself. She looked down at her hands. The same hands that had wiped down piano keys in a cramped studio just a month ago. The same hands that had taught scales to bored children. The same hands that had played background music at a wedding. They were shaking again, but not from fear this time, from possibility. 6 months later, Elena would release her first album. A year later, she'd be touring internationally. 2 years later, she'd open a music school specifically for students who'd been told they weren't good enough, weren't special enough, weren't enough. But tonight, standing backstage at Symphony Hall with her borrowed dress and her impossible hands, she was just Elena Martinez, a piano teacher from above a laundromat, a woman who'd spent 20 years being invisible, a woman who'd finally decided to burn bright, and the whole world was watching.